Dear viewers, today we are going to discuss the development of Middle English prose. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is the dividing line between the old Anglo-Saxon England and the new Anglo-Norman England. It imposed a French-speaking clique in England. As a result, Anglo-French developed as the literary language of the highest classes, and Anglo-Saxon was relegated to the lower classes. Anglo-Saxon, now known as Middle English, remained the language of the vast majority of people and re-established itself as a polite literary language in the 14th century. Though it had changed in many important respects, it had not wholly lost touch with its traditions. In the field of poetry, the rhymed verse of French replaced the Anglo-Saxon alliterative tradition, and the English tradition in prose was overshadowed by the French verse. Though French influence brought rhyme instead of alliteration to English poetry and restricted the range of English prose, Middle English literature was akin to Anglo-Saxon literature. The immediate effect of the conquest was to disrupt the course of English literature considerably. For over 2 centuries, the literature produced under courtly patronage was French, both in tone and in language. On the other hand, English literature of the same period was either based on orature or didactic literature produced by the lower clergy. The Norman conquest, along with some other movements, brought a new Europe into being. By the beginning of the 12th century, this new Europe had established itself as a Christian civilization. The Holy Roman Empire, which was a divinely ordained machinery for the Christianization of Europe, had already come to an end. The heroic age was also gone, and new kinds of courtly sophistication had entrenched itself in life and letters. The new Europe of the Middle Ages was not a heroic society, but a feudal society, with its own conventions of service, honor, and obligation. The Norman conquest hastened the development of feudal organization. More importantly, it brought England more immediately into contact with continental civilization, and especially with the new flowering of French culture, which was to change the pattern of all medieval European literatures. During the 2 centuries and a half after the Norman conquest, English literature kept rising in the social scale. It gradually acquired an ease, a skill, and a polish which enabled it to hold on its own with French. It attained the heights of its excellence in the work of Chaucer. It was at the same time that English language re-established itself as the universal national language. Despite many changes in pronunciation and word structure, English was the legitimate descendant of its Anglo-Saxon parent. At this time, English had split up into different Middle English dialects. Towards the end of the Middle English period, the East Midland dialect became more or less the standard literary language. As a result of the conquest, Wessex lost its political and cultural importance, and its dialect West Saxon also lost its prestige. The regional dialects of Middle English were the descendants of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. The Northumbrian dialect split up into Scots and Northern English. Mercian developed into East Midland and West Midland. West Saxon divided into Southwestern and Central Southern dialects, and Kentish became the basis of the dialects of the Southeast. As French receded even among the upper classes and English moved slowly up in the social scale, the dialect of London reigned supreme. The London dialect had originally been a southern dialect, but by Chaucer's time it had become mainly East Midland in character. Therefore, standard modern English derives from East Midland and not West Saxon. Though an intimate contact with France kept the influence of French culture alive in England, it could not prevent the steady rise of the English language until it became the polite as well as the popular language of England in the 14th century. Besides French and English, there was Latin, the learned language of Christian civilization. Latin had also been the learned language in Anglo-Saxon times, and it was only the dearth of good Latinists in England that led to the use of Anglo-Saxon in didactic literature. If the Danish invasions had not produced a decay of Latin, learning Anglo-Saxon literary prose would never have developed as it did. If the Danish invasions had not produced a decay of Latin learning, Anglo-Saxon literary prose would never have developed as it did. The ecclesiastical reforms introduced into England by the Normans restored the lost glory of Latin and throttled down the tradition of literary English prose. Latin was not only the language of theological and didactic works, it was also the language of science, philosophy, history, and a great deal of poetry. Latin was also the legal language of normal England until it was replaced by Anglo-French, which remained the official legal language of England until 1731. There was also an important Anglo-French literature in England in the 12th and 13th century. Much of it is religious and didactic. By far, the largest number of medieval works in any language are religious and didactic. Works in French written in England during this period also include a number of romances, verse stories, purely written for entertainment. They represent one of the most important branches of medieval secular literature. Anglo-French literature was part of the wider stream of French literature which swept into English literature in the Middle English period and moved it far away from the heroic mold. But what meantime was happening to the native Anglo-Saxon tradition? In poetry, there is little extent to show precisely what was happening to the late 11th and early 12th centuries. In prose, it is easier to trace the continuity of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Its variety and liveliness had made Anglo-Saxon prose remarkable among European literatures of the period. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a tradition of historical prose was maintained for centuries. The last entry was made in the middle of the 12th century. The continuity of English prose from the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period to the Middle English period is demonstrated by the Chronicle more clearly than anywhere else. The Norman clerics who took over the local and national administrative positions in England after the conquest introduced Latin as the language of official communication and historical record. Consequently, English historical prose did not emerge again until the time of the Tudors. At the same time, English writers who came under the sway of French influence resorted to rhymed verse rather than prose for historical writing. Interestingly, divergent dialects of Middle English helped to make a standard literary prose impossible. In homiletic and devotional prose, the tradition was not lost. It operated under its own steam. The work of instructing people in the vernacular went on. Thus, the Anglo-Saxon homiletic tradition continued to flourish, and English religious prose prospered side by side with the new French verse renderings of similar literature. The mass of homiletic literature operated full-throated in the west of England in the 13th century. So the West Midland dialect of this period carried English religious prose safely through the danger period to provide continuity with the prose of Tudor times. The fact that Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, retained his seat of authority after the conquest until his death in 1095 must have helped to encourage this vernacular prose tradition in the West. It is significant that after his death, his biography was written in English. The earliest writings based on the lives of saints after the conquest are known as the Catherine Group. It is a treatise pointing at the discomforts of marriage and advantages of virginity. Written in conscious literary prose, these works were addressed to a female audience. Similarly, Enkarena Ravira, a manual of instruction intended for three young girls, was addressed to a female audience. It was written probably about 1200 in West Midland dialect, and its influence and popularity were enormous. Its influence ensured the transmission of the prose tradition of the Anglo-Saxon homilies to such writers as Richard Rolle, a 14th century mystic, and his follower Walter Hilton. Rolle is important both for his devotional piety and the cogency of his prose. There is a modern ring to his prose style because of the simple directness of his word order. Of Rolle's followers, Walter Hilton is the most interesting. Hilton's prose work, The Seal of Perfection, which debates the respective claims of active and contemplative life, is another important document in the history of English prose style. Contemporary with Walter Hilton is John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a nonconformist. He is known for his ruthless attacks on the practices of the church. He is also known for the first complete translation of the Bible into English. The Wycliffe Bible is joint venture of Wycliffe, Nicholas of Hereford, and John Purvey. The translation is done from the Latin version of the Vulgate. It lacks the idiomatic flow of Rolle's prose. Modern scholars are inclined to put Rolle and Hilton far above Wycliffe because both of them are responsible for the continuity of English prose from Anglo-Saxon to modern times. What is more, they are also pioneers of English prose style. They helped to keep a standard of English prose alive until the late 15th century. Henceforth, the development of English prose was part of the natural progress of the English language and its literature. Thank you very much.